All right, it's on.
Beyond.
It's on.
I heard that on my Sunday.
Good evening, everyone. Good evening. Thank you all for coming. I'm Ziad Shahadi, the business administrator for the Borough of Red Bank. Probably saw most of you at the last meeting of the public input session that was held by Walker. If not, well, thank you for coming tonight. I want to just start off by first saying thank you to Dr. Rummage and the Red Bank Public Schools for allowing us to use the space. Space is at a premium, especially for such a large gathering. I do want to recognize also we got our police chief, Darren McConnell, and Sergeant Bo Broadley, also from the police department, and our DPW director, Cliff Keene. I want to ask the elected officials to please stand up also. We've got tremendous support from the Red Bank governing body. We've got Mayor Pat Mena, Councilman Hazem Yassin, Councilman Michael Ballard, Councilwoman Kathy Horrigan, and Councilwoman Kate Trigiano. And so thank you all for your support in making this study possible and supporting the Walker team and being able to gather the information and do what they need to do. And I'm joined by the River Center Executive Director, Jim Scavone, who he and I have been working together hand in hand in facilitating with the Walker team and our other parking consultant, Tom Kalu. So Jim, if you want to introduce some of the River Center folks
Sure.
that we've got here.
We do have some representation from the River Center Board, which has been working very hard on this parking study, all along, meeting with Walker and providing information. So if I could just ask anybody on the River Center Board to please stand. Oh, you're all shy. We have Val Alfiero and Jay Herman, Carl DeAngelis, our board chair, Stephen Catania, and Danny Murphy. So thank you all for being here to support. I really appreciate all of you coming out. I'd also just like to introduce Eileen Kennedy from our staff, who's our operations manager. She's joining us tonight also.
Thank you. So tonight the presentation is much like the input session, going to be coordinated, facilitated, and largely done by Walker. They've got a very lengthy but important and meaningful presentation that digests the study, and it's 72 plus pages, I think, 72 pages, is it? 81, I'm sorry. 81 pages, all of which has been posted on the Red Bank Borough website, and I believe is also being posted on the River Center website. So if you want to download the full report, you can do so by visiting redbanknj.org. But the presentation tonight is going to digest some of that. There's a lot to cover, as you would imagine, from something of this magnitude. So we are dedicating 30 to 45 minutes to the presentation itself. And after that, there's going to be time for Q&A, but we have a hard stop of 8:15. And the Q&A really should focus on, rather than offering your comment on what you think of this and your opinions on this, informative questions of Walker to understand a little bit of their analysis and how they came to the conclusions that they came to. That's to really keep the meeting on point and as beneficial as possible. And I also want to recognize Councilman Eric Engstrom, Council President this year. Engstrom, also the chair of the Council Committee on Parking. So with that being said, I will turn it over to Brian and Carrie from Walker.
Thank you. Good evening, and thanks for coming out on a cold night to hear about parking. I'm going to present the first part of the study, which is the planning portion, sort of the parking demand analysis, and walk you through some of the findings. We did a survey that was posted online. We also did a survey downtown, talked to some people, did a sort of origin and destination survey, and I want to share the findings of those and thank those of you who contributed. We got a really great response. About 500 people responded, which is terrific. And then after I talk about that, I'll turn it over to Brian to talk about operations and management and sort of the recommendations for moving the parking system forward. So the first part of the study was a supply and demand analysis to look at your parking system. We looked at it on multiple days. We looked at it on weekdays, weekends, event days, non-event days when nothing was going on. And this is a sort of a heat map that shows you in the sort of core of the downtown what the occupancy rates look like. This was this was the peak hour during a weekday, during the daytime, so not during an event time. And you can see the color coding there. Anything coded in red means that it's above 85% occupancy, which is, for all intents and purposes, at its capacity. You can't really be at 100% of capacity because then you're too crowded. So what we found in the study, and you'll see this and on the next slide as well, the weekend, overall there is parking in the core downtown, and the core being sort of from just east of Broad Street down to about Bridge, and from front down a little past Monmouth. Overall, there is capacity in the system. There are spaces available, even at busy times. But there are areas that are very crowded, that are above their effective capacity. They're close to 100% full, and that's why people have, the perception of having a difficult time parking. There are areas where it's difficult to park. We got this feedback back in the surveys, and I'll get to that in a moment. Overall, though, there are pockets of parking available, and then some areas where you are at capacity. Same thing on Saturday. This was a Saturday where there was a pretty large event at the Bay Sea Theater. Not quite a full house, but almost a full house. There was also an event at the Two River Theater at 6 o'clock when you have people downtown for dinner anyway, and then people already starting to roll in for the theater events. You can see how much red, and the red lines are the on-street parking, and then the filled-in blocks are the off-street blocks. So you can see the parking, it was much busier at that point. There's some areas of congestion, particularly along on-street parking at night when the meters have expired, are no longer running. But even here, and even with an event at the Bay Sea, there were parking spaces available sort of spread out throughout the downtown. So overall, the occupancy rate was reasonable with pockets of very, very crowded parking. That probably doesn't surprise you. We also looked at private parking, which is parking that is reserved for, privately owned and reserved for specific tenants of a building. You do have a few privately owned parking facilities that are available to the general public, and we looked at those as well. Here you can see a big sea of green. So in your private parking supply, you have a lot of space available. You have a few areas that are very, very crowded up near the hospital, and the private lots on the same block as the White Street public lot, the Jersey Transit lots down there on blocks 32 and 33. But overall, a lot of capacity in the private parking system. And again, some of those are available to the public. Many of them are reserved for specific tenants. They're not part of the supply that you can use. That was a weekday. Same thing on a Saturday, even more capacity in the system. Lots of these, the green is less than 50% full, so you see a huge amount of empty parking. Another thing that we did is in a few places along Broad Street, Front Street, and Monmouth Street, we collected partial license plates, not full license plates, but we collected partial license plates so that we could look at how long people stay. And what was interesting, we did this during the weekday when the meters are operational. What we saw was a lot of cars that stayed past 2 hours. Out of 105 meters that we were counting, 16 of those were occupied for more than 4 hours of the day, so basically half the time we were looking. Another 11 spaces were occupied for more than 6 hours, and in some cases 8. We just saw the same license plate all day. So people going out and feeding meters. If you add up all those cars that stayed, all the sort of hours worth of cars staying, those 27 cars that stayed 4 or more hours, that's displacing upwards of 60 customers. And so this is one of the things that our recommendations are geared to help you improve. That's a natural tendency. Employees come downtown, they get to work early, they look for the convenient spaces too while they're still open, and they feed meters. But that displaces customers. And so when you have this perception, well, not perception, when you see all those red lines on the key blocks in the core area, those are very busy parking spaces. That's where customers want to come downtown, and they can't necessarily get into those spaces. And part of it is because they're occupied for long, long periods of time by people who work in the area. So that's something that we will address. Finding ways to free up those spaces will create a lot of spaces for customers in more convenient locations, which I think would make everybody happy. So, right, so long-term use of spaces, promotes the perception that there's no parking downtown. I wanted to go to Broad Street and I couldn't get to Broad Street, so I had to go and park somewhere else. And obviously, customers should be able to park closer to the destinations. A few things from the parking survey. So again, we did an online survey. We did an in-person survey downtown where we asked people directly. And these are just some of the sort of characteristics of the parking system. I'm going to run through these pretty quickly so we can get to the sort of operational issues. Not surprisingly, if you look at where you live, you have a lot of people coming from neighboring towns. We all know Red Bank's a destination for shopping and for theater and for dining. So actually the majority are not from Red Bank. The most common reason for visiting downtown Red Bank was dining, movies, bars, shopping. Interestingly, a lot of people visit downtown Red Bank very frequently. And some of those are employees, obviously, who answered the survey. But you do have a lot of people who come here a lot. So people complained about the parking, and we'll get to that in a minute, but people are still coming. You have a lot of frequent visitors. Not surprisingly, the overwhelming majority drove alone, but you did have a fair number of people walking. You've had a fair amount of residential development in and around downtown, and those people are walking. When we asked people where they parked, it's actually about split between on-street meters and lots, but on-street meters obviously is a favorite location for visitors to an area. They like the convenience. How much time do you spend finding parking? As you can see, there was actually almost 25% of people said it took them more than 10 minutes. Part of that, I think, is circling around, and you have a lot of one-way streets that make it a kind of a long circuit to get back. But you did have a fair number of people saying it took them 10 minutes to park, but you also had a lot of people saying that they could park within a few minutes or park immediately, which I thought was interesting. How far from your destination do you park? This was not about event parking, this was just sort of day-to-day visits. Again, a lot of people park within 2 blocks, on site or within 2 blocks, and the large majority of people do end up parking within 3 blocks of their destination. And you had just over 20% who say they park more than 3 blocks away. This I thought also was an interesting result. Many more people than I would have expected said that up to 10 minutes or more than 10 minutes is acceptable to them. Basically a third of the respondents, but obviously the majority of people want to be able to park within 5 minutes. They don't want to spend more than that. And that's why we're going to work on solutions to open up parking near core destinations. And this is what walking distances looks like. So from that P right in the middle at the White Street lot, the radius within that, the yellow is a 2-minute walk, orange is a 5-minute walk, and the darker orange is an 8-minute walk. So you can get pretty far out in the downtown within an 8-minute walk. That's a little less than half a mile at a normal walking speed. More survey results. The issues that affect a negative view of downtown parking. I think probably are not very surprising. A lot of people saying there are too few spaces. And then the second favorite answer was that parking is available, that got cut off, but that parking is available, but it's too far away, or farther away than people would like. Some people talked about restrictions. A lot of people said other, and those responses had to do with pricing of parking, and some people commented on the permit spaces. They got to write in answers there. They commented on permit spaces in the surface lots that it was difficult to park because there were so many surface permanent spaces where you couldn't put your car even if they were empty. Parking access and safety. So those are the key issues. A lot of it centers on availability and being able to park close to where you want to go. We also asked about mobility, which is sort of more general getting around in downtown. That includes traffic, it includes being able to bike, being able to walk, what the environment is for circulation. Again, the overwhelmingly favorite answer was that circulation is difficult, that downtown is congested. A bunch of people talked about unpleasant or unsafe walking conditions or biking conditions. There were a bunch more under the other where people specified an answer. A lot of people talked about how difficult it is to walk, that it's not safe to be a pedestrian, that it's not safe to bike, that there are inadequate bike lanes. Lack of transportation options. It's hard to get to downtown without a car. So getting back to the demand portion of the study, we talked about sort of how people perceive the downtown, and I think you see, I think a lot of the comments in that survey are very similar to the kind of comments that we got when we met with you and with the public in our first meeting. Pretty mixed between people who say overall there is enough parking, and I recognize that, but the distances are far. Some people said I really don't mind walking, we should adapt to that. Other people said I really don't want to walk. Some people said the parking's pretty cheap. Some people said the parking's pretty expensive. That's sort of a typical response. People have very different opinions, and it's a very personal issue. What one person considers a long walking distance, obviously another person might not. So getting back to then the demand analysis. So we looked at the available supply. We looked at how much surplus is in the system. And then we talked to staff about what kind of changes are going to be happening in the downtown that are going to impact parking going forward. So we kind of know what the situation is now. So we are asking where we're headed. And I don't think we need to sort of go into the details of this analysis, but essentially what we did is we looked at what the surplus is now during the peak time, during the weekday, and the peak time on that weekend evening when there were events at the Basie and the Two River Theater. We looked at what kind of parking demand would be added, and the bottom there describes the scenario, the growth scenario, which is that the Basie is expanding. It will have some daytime occupancy, rehearsal space, and educational space. It will have a 550-seat theater that will be active at night. There is vacant retail and restaurant space downtown that will lease up and generate demand. And there is second-story office space, particularly along Broad Street, that when it leases up will generate demand. So we did a projection where we figured out how much demand, how much parking that would add under those conditions, how that adds to the supply, to what's available, and what you end up with in terms of a surplus or deficit. And at both times, you end up with a deficit, and the weekday is actually the worst deficit because there aren't as many overflow facilities available to the Basie and to the Two River Theater has parking. So the weekday is actually the larger deficit. You have office space leasing out, and we projected 220 space deficit going forward if all of those build-outs happen. And then moving it forward, once we've determined that, we know what the difficult points are in your parking system now, you see where you're headed, and then the second part of the study that Brian is going to talk about has to do with operations and management techniques to help try and improve how the parking system functions for people.
So what are we going to do operationally? What we did is we actually sat with a number of stakeholders that were identified by the River Center or by the city. There was approximately, I think, 25 or 30 individuals that were interviewed. We also sat with city staff, and we also made observations of the parking program, both during the weekday and during the weekend period. What we've come up with is basically there is no one person managing parking. There are a lot of hands managing parking, whether it be Public Works, whether it be the City Council, whether it be Z. There are a lot of decision makers, and with that, a lot of best industry practices aren't being adhered to. To overcome that, we are making a recommendation that a parking manager be hired, someone well-versed in the parking industry who can start to manage and control and plan for parking here in Red Bank. With that, we're also asking that the parking utility be empowered. And what we mean by empowered is that the political influences that affect parking here in Red Bank are removed, and the parking utility is allowed to move forward and implement best industry practices as they feel necessary. If that can't be done, well, maybe we need to look at creating a parking authority. In addition, the parking utility should be a self-funding entity. Parking operations, parking improvements should not fall on the backs of residents, the cost. That should be a user-supported system, and that's what these recommendations are geared to. So with that, we are recommending a 3-year cycle to eliminate the transfer of surplus parking revenue to the general fund, putting that back into the parking utility for improvements such as paving, new parking meters, and other technologies. With that, replacing these existing single-space on-street meters with single-space smart meters utilizing dual heads that accept credit cards. Replace all off-street meters with multi-space meter technology, going to pay-by-plate technology versus pay-by-space. And we'll go a little further into that technology as we go on. Replace worn and vandalized regulatory signage, convert the parking enforcement program to LPR technology, and develop a capital improvement program for the surface parking lots. Now, going back to license plate recognition, to help control cost of enforcement staff, most communities today are going to license plate recognition. What occurs there is a vehicle or a handheld device actually tracks your license plate, whether it be in an on-street location or an off-street location, instead of a parking enforcement officer going around and plugging this data in. They would simply drive up and down the streets or the aisles, and the system would automatically take that information. And as they make their rounds, those individuals who were parking 2, 4, and 6 hours in areas where they weren't supposed to can be cited. It's simply a different method of tracking. With the development, with the hiring of a parking professional, as Carrie had indicated, there was a large amount of private sector space that is available for public use. So what we'd like to do is encourage the borough to work with some of the private sector landowners to come up with shared use agreements during peak periods. And then internally evaluate the restart of the payment in lieu of program for development. We're not saying that this has to be done. What we're saying is this should be evaluated as time goes on and development really starts to occur in Red Bank. With the update of parking meter technology, extending the parking enforcement hours until 9 p.m. Mondays through Saturdays. That recommendation is made due to the fact that your greatest demand is happening during the evening hours. And there is no control of the parking spaces during those hours because the enforcement staff effectively is off the street by 4:30. So after that, it's the Wild West. Everybody just looks for a parking space and takes care of themselves. With the enforcement of the parking policies till 9 p.m., we believe that that will help you increase the public perception of more available parking. And again, no development or redevelopment project should be approved without the sign-off of the parking manager. During the surveys, the public surveys that we had both online and the stakeholder interviews that we conducted, wayfinding was always an issue. With that, there are recommendations in the report on a signage program, identifying and branding the parking lots and different methods to get people directly to the lot instead of hunting for the facility. Adopt convenient pricing on Broad Street, White Street, and Monmouth Street. This is sort of like if you were going to a theater or if you were attending a sports venue. You want a better seat, you're going to pay a higher price. And that's what's going to happen here, or what we're recommending on the street. If you want to park right in front of your destination, you're going to pay a little more for that luxury. Reassign employee parking to all lots except White and English Street. That's pretty much self-explanatory. Adjust the rates of the program to restrict long-term parking in the White Street lot. Presently, there are 4-hour parking restrictions in the White Street lot, but the borough is not enforcing that regulation. There's a lot of parking occurring in that lot by students. We counted on different days and ranging anywhere from 20 to 26 different vehicles from the school parking there. So what we're saying is there are different methods to control that. One is through rates, the other is through technology, and it's all laid out in the report. Adjust the rates of the program. Next. Increase staffing according to need. As the parking program becomes a little more successful, parking enforcement staff may be required. And what we're saying as far as the parking garage, which we haven't discussed as of right yet, is to conduct a parking supply and demand analysis in 2 years to reevaluate the parking conditions and need. What we're saying is that due to the fact that a lot of policies and procedures and pain that you're feeling are self-inflicted, we'd like to see you correct those issues prior to the development of any new parking inventory. We believe that the recommendations provided operationally will help you do that, will help you move your demand to lesser used areas, will open up parking to your visitors and your restaurant goers. We'd also like to develop a structured parking to support demand only after utilizing inventory to its greatest level possible. So are we saying that you need a garage? We're not saying that you need a garage right now based on your operational conditions. It would be foolish for us to say that you need a parking garage based on your current operational conditions due to the fact that your parking program is broken. There are a number of steps that need to be taken to correct it. There's nothing here that is revolutionary, cutting edge. It's all basic parking 101, best industry practice that is being recommended here. Along with those recommendations, we've supplied an implementation schedule, sort of a roadmap that plays out over a 2-year period. We've also estimated the dollar value to each of the recommendations based on 2018 dollars. So as you see, if we go down the list, it falls in line with what we've just discussed. Empower the parking director, the utility, wean the general fund of the parking revenues and reinvest parking revenues into parking. Replace the on-street parking meters and convert all off-street parking. Again, the signage program, meter replacement, identify your capital improvement program, work with your private lot owners, extension of enforcement hours. So everything that we've gone through, there are costs associated with each of them. A lot of them are no cost, and a lot of the recommendations here are the recommendations provided in this implementation schedule are provided in chronological, logical order. This is basically what you have here in the report is a roadmap for success based on what we've seen as deficiency here in Red Bank. So I don't believe that there's anything here that's really controversial. I know that there's been some comment about the need for an individual to manage parking. I believe that is the most important recommendation here, and that's why it is listed as number one. Although there are a lot of great people on staff, there is no one person in the administration that is well versed on parking and what parking policies and programs, what effect they have on each other. So that recommendation is made for that reason. So with that, turn it over to Z. I think he wanted to.
Just briefly before we go into the Q&A portion, I know one question that's probably going to be on everybody's minds is what's next, right? And the River Center board got a copy of this. The mayor and council received a copy of this just around the same time as this being released publicly. And the action plan in the coming weeks, coming months, is to meet with the parking committee of the mayor and council, along with a stakeholder committee group of River Center, and others that those groups feel want to be brought into the process, should be brought into the process, and look at this implementation timeline and figuring out how we're going to actually put that plan into action. There's a lot of considerations that go into these. There's the financial component that, as you saw, right next to every one of those steps is either a cost, no cost, some revenue projections. We have to, as part of a municipality, develop a budget, a utility budget annually for the parking utility, and the same thing for the municipal budget. So we have to look at which of these decisions are going to have different financial impact on our budget and on the utilities budget, and how we're going to play those out over the next few months, next year, 2 years, to effectuate some of those. And we want to be able to look at, we look at the recommendations in this report seriously, and with the interest of being able to implement them all as best as possible within our constraints, operationally and financially.
No, I mean, you said it very well. I think, we've had a lot of questions about, like Z said, how are you going to implement this? And I think that's what is involved in the next step, is sitting down and really determining the best path forward to implement all of the suggestions in the report. One of the things that was stated very clearly in the report is that the report should be seen and viewed as a whole. Like Brian just said, parking policies have an effect on each other, so it's really hard to cherry pick certain recommendations because they are going to affect other recommendations. So I know from River Center's viewpoint, we are very much looking forward to sitting down with the parking committee of the borough and other stakeholders to really determine the best path to implement all these recommendations and, trying to fix the parking problem that Brian said was broken here in Red Bank. So
with that, we'll open it up to Q&A. Again, if you keep your questions to questions, a lot of people tend to want to prelude their questions with commentary, so please keep it to questions so that most people can ask their questions, and to keep it to the point of understanding the analysis, the fact gathering, and the assumptions and conclusions that Walker came to. Back to you guys.
Yes, sir. You were first.
What I find is a lot of people, my friends in Long Branch, Eatontown, Middletown, places that don't have a downtown, say, I don't come to Red Bank because there's no parking. How do we assess the loss of that business? They're not part of your survey because they're not here now. How do we assess the impact if they do come back on parking, and how do we assess the loss that's existed over these many years of parking frustration?
That's a great question, and the answer is there is no way to assess that impact. That's anecdotal information, and we hear it in a lot of places, but we really don't have a way of saying, is that 20 cars, is that 50 cars, is that 200 cars? We really don't know. So I think when you have a well-organized parking system with a parking manager who's keeping tabs on how the parking occupancies are working, and that's part of the thing they pay attention to, you'll see how parking demand grows, and part of the benefit of holding off a little bit on building a garage is, you know, as the parking system gets repaired, you may see a bounce back that can, you know, that may influence that decision going forward. But it's a great question that unfortunately we don't know what's lost, only what we see.
Yes, sir.
We're obviously moving towards smart technology on meters. Did you consider the fact that you could collect the data and have real-time apps and signage that tells people where there's parking available?
Those recommendations are in the report. We do talk about dynamic signage.
Okay, great.
Yes, sir.
You might address this further into the report since you're only giving us a summary, but you recommend enforcing the time limits that are in the parking lots right now and trying to move the employees elsewhere. Employees still have to be here past the 4-hour limits. Are those other lots going to be rearranged so that employees can stay here longer than the 4-hour limits?
Yes, that is the goal of that recommendation. One of the other items that was also discussed and that came up in the surveys was safety. And obviously, service workers who are working, you know, past midnight are also concerned about getting back to their vehicles safely. So we've addressed some of the safety issues there as well.
Do you want to talk about the spaces so that we're not reserving it?
Yeah. One of the recommendations that you'll see in the report and why we recommended license plate recognition technology is to get away from those permit spaces. A lot of times you'll pull into the White Street lot and people are getting frustrated because during peak periods, I can't park. You know, here's these open spaces I have to drive by, but they're open for permit parking. Permit or monthly style parking should never be reserved. That's a parking principle. The only thing that monthly parking permits should do is buy down the price of parking versus paying on a daily basis. That's it. All municipal parking should always be on a first come, first served basis. Yes, sir.
I only had one question, but now I got like 3 based on the other questions. First of all, a little bit about your methodology. When you compared the Saturday to the weekday, when did you do those surveys? Was it while school was in session or?
Yes.
Okay.
In fact, we had, the study was originally, we were sort of funded to do the study, and it started during the summer, and so we held off doing it then, and so we waited until school was in session. So this is a fall weekday, typical weekday. So we did 2 weekdays and 2 Saturdays, and one of each was an event day. So we were able to see the impact of event parking.
And could you just go into a little bit more about the difference between the Saturday and the weekday, particularly the evening? Because you showed on the chart where you showed the deficit was higher during the weekdays, which I'm finding that really counterintuitive. So I'd love you to flesh that out a little bit.
Sure. Sorry, I'm scrolling. Okay, here we go. The reason that the deficit becomes bigger on the weekday is partly because you have some of the new demand that we're adding in is from office space. You have more demand on the weekend, but you also have a large supply that is available. That demand, that large number on the weekends is from the theaters. But you also have a big supply that's available. The garage at 140.
The permit people aren't there, and
well,
they don't go out at 2 o'clock.
Aren't...
Would that be a case where that would affect it?
Yeah, the permit people, but also, you know, for the Count Basie, the garage at 141 West Front Street, which is where the Plaza restaurant is, that big office development. That garage at night has, you know, a lot of space, and that's actually not far from the Basie. So, you know, people are gravitating towards the White Street lot in part because that garage it's not very clear that it's actually public parking. And the Basie does advertise it on their website. They do say that it's
not public parking anymore. They changed that, did they not?
Public, but it's paid.
It's paid
But
parking,
the public is allowed.
anyone can drive in there. And it does have spaces available right now during the day, but at night it's an office building, it will have a ton of space. So there's a lot of resources available for the theaters at night that you don't have available really during the day for the demand. So that's why there's that difference.
Okay.
You can see the available supply at night. That usable additional public surplus of 400 spaces on the weekend is what makes the difference.
One last question. What is your thinking on going to the dual parking meters on the street as opposed to the boxes, which are working successfully in a lot? And I would think one box per block would be cheaper than a bunch of smart heads.
You would think. However, nationally, there are a lot of communities, large communities, that are staying with single space meters simply for convenience. We also looked at the survey that was taken, and it seems that not a lot of people like those kiosks. That's why we're saying that really, just for convenience, and so that it doesn't become or stay a meter farm where you just see rows of meters. We're saying, hey, look, we can get rid of half the meter poles on the street by going to dual heads. That's the dual head recommendation. Yes, sir.
Two-part question. First, the impact benefit of the valet parking, should that be expanded? You haven't touched on that at all in certain parts of the downtown in the evening and weekends. And number two, based upon Walker's professional expertise, what are the top 3 most impactful recommendations that could be the most quickly implemented?
Your first question on valet parking, we do discuss valet parking in great length in the report. Initially, we're saying that you have a private sector valet program running. It seems to be running somewhat successfully. Let's let it run. Right now, I would not put the parking utility in charge of that until they gain control of their parking program. Once they do, the recommendation in the report is to evaluate the use of valet parking both during day and evening hours. And we've also supplied an ordinance that can be used by the Borough of Redmond. Your second question was? Oh, the top 3.
Recommendations that could be most impactful in
1, 2, 3. Those are them. That's why we listed them in this order. They are listed by priority. And again, these recommendations, as Carrie stated earlier, and Jim touched upon as well, are not designed to be taken a la carte. They're all intertwined. So the success of one program is related to the other. But unless you're going to put a consultant on staff to help you steer your parking ship, you really need to look for a parking manager. Yes, sir.
2 questions. First, why did you pick 9 p.m. for the expanded hour? What is behind that hour? Why not midnight? Why not 8? And the second question is, as far as weaning the general fund off parking revenues, where will that 5% of the town's budget come from?
Sir, I don't know where that dollar will come from. What I'm telling you is, as a user-supported system, those dollars have to go back into the parking program. You have costs associated to all these recommendations. If there were parking reserves, we could easily address them in the next week or so. There's no parking reserves. So without reserves, it's very difficult. We knew that it was going to be painful. That's why we drew it out over a 3-year period. It's really the way it has to go. You need to convert from a, I'll say, general fund supported parking program to a user supported program that sits alone and has no impact on any resident.
And the 9 p.m.?
The 9 p.m. is based on the operational conditions here, what we saw. Carrie only identified a couple days. When we started crunching data, we were out here a lot more than we were contracted to be because some of the numbers looked a little off to us. I was here. There were a number of other junior staff members that were here. I would stop in and see Jim to let him know we were here. But 9 p.m. seems to be the magic hour now. If it needs to go longer, that's something that can always be reevaluated, but initially it should be 9 p.m. And usually what occurs at 9 p.m., your enforcement staff is usually off the street by 8. Yes, ma'am.
So I was wondering, do you advise a parking area for employees and long-term parking?
Yes,
And
we
did you
do.
Did you look to the east side lots?
Yes, we did. And that's, we're saying it could be anywhere. It could be the Wallace lots,
Right.
it could be anywhere but English and White Street.
And so that will free up a lot more parking in the White Street parking lot.
Yes, ma'am. And what's going to happen is with this license plate recognition technology, once you start running through, all that data is going to be there for your parking manager to crunch. He'll be able to see those license plates, and just like Carrie had this slide up here that showed, you know, what these vehicles were doing on street, that information that is derived from that system is going to tell you the same thing. So that technology is going to help you set future policy. So, okay, well, now I've got people staying 6, 7 hours. Do I want that to happen? If I do, maybe I want to adjust the rates so that I make it a little more financially unattractive. And maybe if they're going to be here 8 hours, we send them over to the east side lot.
And did you consider reverse diagonal parking on Broad Street? And did you consider diagonal parking in the White Street parking?
In the White Street parking lot, no. It does not make sense. You'll lose inventory.
Oh,
On street, we did, and it's in the report, in great length.
Is it good?
Is it good? Yes, it's good. Whether it's implementable, we don't know. There's also, in the reverse angle parking, we also talk about bicycle lanes and how that interacts with reverse angle parking. So you really have to, the borough is going to have to weigh which is more important, bicycle parking or angle parking? I'm sorry, bicycle lanes or angle parking?
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir, you're not recommending we jump to 9 o'clock right away without getting other things in place?
No, we're just gonna go down this, we're gonna go down this schedule. That's all. So,
Okay. The majority of this is long-term meaning 1, 2, 3 years. Right now, we have an immediate problem, of course, in the downtown district, and there's issues they've been working on for 20 years that I've been involved with. But recently, with the removal of the 154 spots at the Two River Theater, the opening of Triumph, which seats 260 inside, another 80 or 90 outside. I seat 130, and the theater seats 350. So that means there's 700 people that need parking now. There's, other than the meters on the street. What would you think of bringing the same type of valet system we have on Broad Street over to the Arts and Antique District? So we're trying to accommodate some of the people, especially seniors, who are trying to find a place to get to.
valet parking in that area will work. However, you're gonna have to strike a deal for storage of those vehicles with Matt Cali for the use of their garage. For the 141
Yeah.
West Front Street garage.
Right.
That would be probably the closest facility to maintain acceptable headways to get those vehicles back.
Yeah, there's also 91 spaces on the roof of the parking garage behind me that no one uses. Because the tenants, rightfully so, don't want to park on the roof or go to the first floor. But now they control the garage. And it's expected.
Well, again, is valet parking on the first year's schedule? No, it's not. There are a number of other priorities that are ahead of valet parking. However, valet parking could come up in prioritization if it was deemed that it was extremely necessary. Well, right now, our stakeholder meetings we had, not a lot of people were interested in valet parking.
No, they're not. Nobody wants to pay for it.
Then you have to look at, are we going to subsidize the program? Is River Center going to come to the table? Is the parking utility going to pay?
Well, the parking, the valet parking on Broad Street is basically self-contained, whereas who's ever running the charge is $7 a car. or more if they're on the street. And we could implement the same thing on the RCD district and basically find areas for them to park in. And then the valet system would not cost anything to us. That could be one way to go.
Well, don't say that there's no cost to us. There's a lot of liability that comes along with the valet parking program. If it was required that a valet program be implemented almost immediately, my recommendation would be to privatize it. Go to a private parking operator, contract with them. However, you need to oversee those valet operators. You need to adopt the valet parking ordinance. You can't just say, we're going to put valet parking here. There's a lot of back office work that needs to be done.
Isn't the demand in the theater district a lot different than the restaurants? And you would have lots of cars coming within 20 minutes. Valet would be very difficult, wouldn't
It would require a large ramping area and curbside space, and would also require a significant amount of staff to make sure that those vehicles are not ramped on the curbside more than 5 minutes.
And they have to be driven somewhere too.
That's correct. And then your headway back, industry standard is 7-8 minutes, people get antsy. So that vehicle has to be back to the user within 7-8 minutes if this program is going to be considered a success by the public. Yes, sir.
As you surveyed Red Bank, does the report indicate how we've been managing up to now? We have the busiest theater in New Jersey, the Two River Theater, and restaurants that are thriving. Did you have any sense from your work in other communities how we've made it this far?
What? You've made it this far because you have the destinations that people want to come to. So they're overcoming what is perceived to be not a user-friendly system.
So if they want to come, they will find a place to park.
Yes, they will. However, going back to quantifying how many people aren't coming here, if you can increase the public perception that parking is available in Red Bank, then who knows what success level you're going to see with that.
We'll have theaters complaining that they're overrun with too many people.
There you go. Yes, sir.
You noted public-private relationship. Could you count within a 5-minute walking how many large volume private parking lots there are? How many spaces?
I don't have that number offhand. There were, with the private supply, some of it is small lots sort of dotted behind buildings and, 30 to 40 spaces, say, some even smaller than that. There were a fair number of lots with 100+ spaces. I don't have a count offhand, but there are several locations where there are sizable lots serving private businesses. And again, and of course there is the garage at 141 West Front Street, which is, we would call that a public garage. I mean, it's privately owned, but it is available to the public if you want to pay. And that has almost 400 spaces. That's a big garage.
Right.
So there's that one. And then there are smaller ones, and I don't remember the names of the buildings, some of them fairly close to Broad Street, interestingly, and they've got, say, 100 spaces. We did see those in use. We could tell some of them were offices that would have been emptying out at night, but on the nights when the BASI was active, we saw those lots fill up. So in a sense, you already have people kind of figuring out that they can use the, people are informally using the private supply already, I think, during events, which is a great use of space. It's over 1,000 spaces, in the private lots. It's a huge inventory. So, people are figuring out how to make use of it, and that's the great thing. The asphalt's already there.
Yes, sir.
All right, could you go back to the slide with I think it was towards the beginning, which showed the different groups of people that took the survey? That showed the people living in town versus neighboring town. Right, where does it? Okay, I thought that this was interesting because people who live in Red Bank
Our sidewalk surveys were, the people who were actually performing the sidewalk surveys were fluent in Spanish, yes.
Okay, great. This is very, there's a very specific part of town that is more frequented by that community, and I'm glad to notice that outreach did include them, because if it didn't, I thought these results might be much different. I'm glad to hear that.
Yes, sir.
Did you look at the impact on traffic on the streets of your plan? I mean, that should be a goal to improve that as well.
Yeah, let's go back to where we find congestion as being one of the major issues here. We believe a good portion of that line is people hunting for spaces. There may be available spaces not within very close proximity to their destination, but they want to park out in front of their destination. There's nothing that we can do about that. There's nothing.
No, but I'm just asking because I mean, even moving people to remote lots will require traffic flow to them, from them. So I just want to know.
Well, we believe that the operational recommendations we have will have an impact, a positive impact on that line.
Okay, the other question is I would think you would want to encourage people to come here for businesses in the daytime. It ought to be a different pricing scheme, not the same as nighttime. As a customer here, it's very disturbing to have to spend $2 for parking when my lunch special is only $6.
Again, we have to upgrade the technology to do that. The parking meters that you have on street are not capable of doing that right now. Once we upgrade technology, that is
and
an
you would
option.
consider that, because I mean, the goal here should be encouraging business, and customers, not raising revenue.
Yeah, I think we talked about a flat rate in the report after 6 o'clock, so that, if you pull up, you don't have to worry about coming back out to feed a meter. It's a flat rate. That's it. Yes, ma'am.
This question may piggyback off of the comment that the gentleman made concerning private space. I didn't read the report, so I don't know if you addressed it or not, but there are private entities that are approaching businesses in and around our town to buy up or to rent spaces. And I'm wondering, is that something that maybe the borough should consider, and maybe offering some sort of incentive to private businesses in order to be able to use their spaces? Because that will lay some of that cost that comes about in finding spaces. Maybe, I don't know, a tax incentive or some other type of incentive, because private companies are already approaching businesses in the very same format, and businesses are responding to that in the sense that they can make revenue from renting their spaces out. So was that a part of the study, and is that a consideration that you have looked at, and is there any type of incentive that the city might make to the businesses right here in town for renting out spaces? Private businesses.
Yes, one of the recommendations that we have is to strike deals with the private sector to have those private sector lots available to the public when that private sector isn't needing those lots. Shared use. Now, if private sector firms are taking it upon themselves to go into the parking business, that's fine right now, but it may be something that the borough wants to look at and regulate. There should be standards for safety, lighting, landscaping, pedestrian access. So, these are things that, again, there's no cut and dry answer here. Every time you look at something, it's very complex because basically nothing's in place. So we've got to start the program pretty much from scratch. But yes, we did look at that. Yes, ma'am.
On that slide, on the second one down, it says on-street meters installed, enforcement is the $50,000 cost. But what's the revenue possibility if you change the more usage of meter? And also at one point you were talking about increasing or changing the rates. Were you able to quantify the revenue impact?
We, by scope, are not required to do that. However, it will be positive. I'm sure the return on investment on the meters alone should be no more than 3 years. Yes, sir.
Did you count or do you know the number of permit spots in English and White?
Yes, we do
White
off
Street
the top of my head.
63 permit spots? I don't remember.
There's none in English Plaza.
Not what?
There's none in English Plaza.
Yeah.
Right, there's private spaces
There's private
sort of next to
spaces, yes.
English Plaza, but White Street, I think, is 63 spaces.
It's
got to be higher than that. They moved a bunch of the borough. Where's the place? The borough last year moved a bunch of the permit spaces out of White Street to the east side lots, as many as they could. Do you remember what's left?
Yeah, it's around 63, 60.
Yeah. They moved 110 permits out of White Street lot.
Did they move the signs?
Yes, they moved the signs.
And is there enough room in the east side lots, considering that some of those are leased out to businesses?
Can we accommodate all of them in the use of
All the permit
Probably
go there?
not. Probably not. However, we do have the ability to take some of the demand at the New Jersey Transit lot after 11 a.m. You do have the ability to use the 141 West Front Street parking garage. Again, these are all things that we would envision the parking manager negotiating with the private sector to get these programs in place.
But there are, one of the Wallace Avenue lots has spaces that are fully reserved. There are also spaces that are, it's the same as White Street, they say permit only for a certain part of the day. If those can be tightened up by a license plate credential so that there aren't empty spaces. I know some of them have to remain because there's a contract for that, but some of them can be, you wouldn't have so many vacant permit-only spaces. You could make use of those spaces, so you can actually squeeze more permits into those lots. I think fairly successfully.
Okay. And you also mentioned that the permits you wouldn't own a spot. That they would basically,
Space
outside of
wouldn't be
those two
reserved.
lots, you could park anywhere in any lot at any time with a permit. And you
Yeah, we envision that with license plate recognition, you wouldn't even have a permit anymore. Your license plate would be a credential.
So have you taken into account the fact that the east side lots do function for customers of businesses a lot along the east side of Broad Street?
Correct.
Okay? And historically, when we've gone to free parking at holiday time, there's a big issue with I'm a business owner, I cannot legally tell my employees, do not park in that closest spot, leave it for a customer. I tell them to please do it, but I can't force them to do it. So what happens with any customers that want to park in the east side lots that now everyone's going to take the closest one, they're not going to take the back side or farther away, they're going to take the closest one possible, and boom, we've cut out our customers from that half of downtown.
I think it would be better to have your customer pull into White Street lot and at least see that there are available spaces. They may not be the most convenient. They may have to walk an extra 50 feet, but at least there are spaces available. Now again, going back, we never use the word free when it comes to parking because there is a cost for the borough to operate parking, whether it be curbside or anything. We always say complimentary. It's not free. So as far as free parking is concerned, you can still manage your permit program even during a free parking period, simply by managing the license plate demand.
But if you push everybody to White Street, now you gotta go across town if you're coming from the other side of Red Bank. And Wallace Street is a lot more convenient than having to go down White Street during the day, let me tell you.
Yeah, but we're not saying that all of the permit holders should be holed up in one spot.
I thought you were implying that Wallace Street would become the employee permit kind of thing.
No, what we're saying is permit parking should happen everywhere except White Street in England.
Okay.
So everything else is open. I mean, even once you get your agreements in place, your private sector agreements, your permit parking could occur in some of those lesser used facilities.
Did you do any analysis of what happens when we go from charging people to go out to dinner from 6 to 9 o'clock, which a lot of people love to come to Red Bank instead of going to Asbury, so they don't have to pay $8 more to park? Do you have any data on that?
I can tell you that we're working in the city of Norwalk right now. They had implemented 9 p.m. parking, I believe. 9 p.m. parking and saw no reduction whatsoever. Again, it's not the parking fee, and again, we're not recommending an increase in parking rates.
Yeah.
We want you to get control of your parking program first. Once you, our recommendation, the only increase in revenues, the only increase in rates that we're recommending is convenience parking. And again, we're not saying that your on-street rates are low. We're not saying they're high. There is a market analysis that was completed by 10 different communities, I think we reviewed. And you are in the ballpark with all those other communities. You're on the high end of the ballpark, but you're in the ballpark.
They take credit cards?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, nobody has parking meters any longer that do not accept credit cards.
What did you say the budget from the meters were for the town? What percentage of what?
Let's see. I think we're talking about $250,000 to $300,000. Yeah. Again, they're under state contract. You don't even have to
I
go.
think he's asking what the revenue from parking, or
We didn't-
what the revenue
And
is.
what percentage of the town's budget is being augmented by the money from the meters right now?
By parking
Didn't you
revenue.
say it was 5% or 10%?
I didn't say percent. I said a dollar.
I said 5%.
He said 5%.
It's about $1 million, $1.3 million, and the budget's 22 million.
So as long as we have the town council
It's
and mayor.
it's 1 point. It's
Are we ready
1.6
to
million.
try to address that and laws of income to the town to help the parking? We should have posted the councilman too.
Okay, let's, questions back to.
Yes, ma'am.
Number one, about how many spots are in the White Street parking lot, and how many spots do we anticipate will be cleared up if the employees park elsewhere?
271 is total number, 63 is permanent.
Okay, so 63.
Yeah, employees park elsewhere too.
Exactly. We're saying spaces that the public can park in because they're reserved. That's what we're.
Talking about the implementation of the program, that, by the way, congratulations to you and to all the people involved. It was a really good research. Talking about the implementation, do you have any kind of recommendations of how subsidized is, like, for example, Count Basie, Seacoast Market, all these big drivers of traffic, big companies, they're driving all these cars into town. Do you have any kind of recommendation on how to subsidize that?
And you're delving into politics. And we like to take parking politics out of parking.
Yeah, and to the same point, I mean, I understand that parking is part convenience from town, and it's also a business. So we need to.
Well, you will see in the report that we refer to Red Bank as the need to operate their parking like a business. One of the reasons that we also said that our fourth recommendation down, no longer allow for approval of any development project to occur without the review and approval of a parking director. And if that means bringing money to the table, so be it. Yes, sir.
Yes, considering that parking has been a perennial issue in Red Bank, coming up, what is the completion time of this if it was adopted? I mean, how soon could it be implemented, and what's its half-life? As you consider that sooner or later, as Red Bank attracts more cafes and all that, we're probably going to revisit the issue of parking again. So what's the half-life of this if it was adopted today?
We don't see an expiration for a shelf life of this report. However, we do say in 2 years to come back, because the program should take 2 years to implement. We're saying come back in 2 years, do another supply-demand analysis, update those numbers as far as the surplus and deficit, and see if you need a garage.
We have to wrap up as promised. 8:15 was our hard stop time because we've got to vacate the school. Again, thank you all for coming here today. I hope you all found this informative.